Brilliant. Thank you, uh, Dimity. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to present some of the work that we've been doing in partnership with a number of growers and other partners in this Water Smart Dams project. And yeah, talking a little bit about some of the different options for farm water supplies. So, as a bit of an introduction to this piece of work, is this really came about from that dry period from 2018, 19, and 20. And there was sort of questions posed to a variety of different groups, Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, to various university partners around, what options have we got to put on the table for our growers and for farm water. And this is a program that emerged out of that. And I think, if I'm right, Dimity, you've got some people speaking tomorrow, maybe on some other parts of this story, maybe around the desalination and groundwater targeting component. I think you've got Richard George from Deep Herd. So you can see here that what we looked at was a range of different options. So there's not one option out there that is right for every grower. Obviously, water depends a lot on what assets and potential, what climate, what farming systems, what demand you've got in all of these components. So we don't propose one single solution. It's really about picking the right solution or the right range of solutions. So the focus of this particular seminar and the work that I led and our team led in partnership with these other groups was around what we call smart dams. So this was really trying to find new options, and we'll sort of unpack what that looks a bit like and what lessons we've learned and what suggestions we've got about where some of the things sit. And then this groundwater targeting and on-farm desalination story that Richard will talk to tomorrow. So this was a partnership supported through the Future Drought Fund and the WA State Government Climate Resilience Fund. And it was a partnership between ourselves at Centre for Water and Spatial Science at UWA with the Grower Group Alliance and Southwest WA Drought Hub. I would flag the Drought Hub does have some a regional advisory committee, and so they're very open and interested people like yourselves to tell us what your needs and what your questions are. And there are regional node advisors that can be found. The Can be found in terms of contacting them with your ideas. And this is one of the projects that has sort of come from that. Also partnering with four grower groups. So the Merredin and Districts Farm Improvement Group in the kind of wheat belt NRM backyard. And also Compass Ag Alliance based around the Darkin area, Southern Dirt around Kojonup, and Fitzgerald Biosphere Group. And this was quite deliberate to try and stratify what we were doing. So working in different kind of geographies and climate from, kind of medium to low rainfall areas, very cropping intensive farming systems, right the way through to, relatively, intensive around the livestock side or mixed farming operations, and also farming operations that do and then very much don't have access to scheme water. So, yeah, trying to look at what that piece looks like. So really what motivated this is we know from some of the remote sensing work that's been done by Deep Herd in particular, there's about 180 to 200,000 farm dams right the way through the southwest. And so what we've actually seen is real struggles for these to work in our modern farming system. So they worked really well when you had 1970s and 80s levels of rainfall and you had lots of livestock in our systems that did a really nice job keeping our soils compacted. Now, obviously, we've done things like going to no-till. There's a hell of a lot less livestock in our systems. Some of our rainfall patterns are changing a little bit. And so all of these factors combined mean that we just don't have the runoff like we used to. And so there's this huge asset that we've got out there, but what can we do? So we've, very much changed our farming systems, doing things like no-till to do more with less, soil moisture, get those crops up and going. That's a really critical strategy that we've been able to use to adapt to where our climate and other things are shifting. And give us that advantage. But we've also got, with these more modern farming systems, a huge reliance on, on summer weed control and of crop emergence pre-emergent spray program. So that's requiring very large amounts of water and very high qualities of water, and right at the end of our dry season. So we actually need to look and think about some of our water supplies and our water resources that we've got on farm, and whether they've kept track with all of those other improvements that we've had to do to stay competitive. Also, comments from some of the growers that we've been working with, the more livestock intensive operators, they're, I guess, starting to plan, what their future in the livestock industry looks like. And their focus is very much now shifting to a much more premium focused sheep production model. And premium sheep production really requires high reliable water, large herds of livestock that you can't necessarily cart water to alleviate on-farm water shortages. If you've got 10 or 14,000 head of sheep, like some of the people we've been working with, there's just not enough water tankers to keep them going. So yeah, focus here is on cheap and reliable on-farm water, non-scheme, non-potable water at low cost. And so this one here is, I guess maybe a bit of a useful one. I've just sort of pulled, as of last night, this one's out of the rainfall to date tool calculator from DPIRD. So I just pulled the record for Cunderdin. So you can see here where we're tracking in the purple. We're sitting around about a decile 3 year at present. And then you show some projections of if we get a decile 1 or 5 or 9 season from here based on historical records. So, we're looking at a season which is, below average. We're going to have some challenges with water. And we've also, got a more lean year in some areas that we came into this season. So a lot of our water resources on farms, have been a little bit depleted. And so that's a really big challenge. So, as always, we're probably in the more sort of challenging and needing water situation. So it's a really useful opportunity to have this conversation. The broader project really looked at on-farm demonstration. So the idea here was not for me to muck around in the laboratory at the university and build little, pretend models and put rainfall simulators on them and come up with answers. This was about going out, into paddocks at scale of adoption, at the scale of farming systems, and putting out things. And this photo here, there's a full-scale cover that we tried down in Gardner, whether it's that or building 1 hectare roaded catchments or other sorts of features. And so there was a whole range of different sites that were tried. You can see in this map a whole range of things, including the desalination stuff that Richard will talk about tomorrow, but also some of the work that we've focused on to try and get some really good R&D numbers to then support some of the planning tools and information. And so some of the different partners that we worked with here in various different locations trying different things. So the focus was very much on some of these options to get more water running into dams, options to keep water in there, other things around evaporation reduction and water quality. Also trialling in some areas with some waterlogging challenges, things like subsurface drainage and diverting that water into dams. And so that was the focus of these sites. And so really we sort of broken it down into 4 key components. And that's really thinking about how do you get more water into your dam? And what we know from when we analyse most dams and their reliability is the key problem is not the dam, but it's their catchment. And so catchment design, catchment performance is really important. And we've done some interesting work and sort of show some of that about why that's important and how much of your rainfall sits in different little niches of where you can sort of capture that. Some of the dam evaporation work in terms of keeping water in dams, some work in particular with MADFIG and around the broader Merredin area looking at fit for purpose water and water quality. And that's really important part, if you're spending, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars on a spray program, a lot of those sprays were developed in, laboratory conditions with high quality water. And those sprays require a high quality water to work as part of your system. And so I think when you're looking at a farming system, say, focus really on spray and crop production, you need high quality, infrastructure in terms of your spray infrastructure to efficiently cover your area. You need the right chemical program with your agronomist. But if you don't have the water and the right quality of water to throw at that, then you've got a really big piece of the puzzle that's missing there, and that's going to have some really significant, problems on your efficiency, on your weed burden, and on your yield. So, water is a really critical part of that puzzle. And then the last one is the water planning tools, and this is the water evaluation platform that we developed through the project. So yeah, I've really kind of emphasized this a little bit before, but a dam is only as good as the catchment that it needs to drive it. So really, what we know is that pasture and crop paddocks are pretty unreliable. Modern no-till farming is quite remarkable for how efficiently we can get crops out of the ground. I think last year was a really interesting study. So we had the third largest grain harvest on record in what across the region was around about a decile 3 to 4 year. So in a below average rainfall year, on average for the southwest, we had a very much above average grain yield. And so that, water has come from other parts of the landscape, i.e., we just don't have that runoff because we've become really efficient in these, below average to near average years of converting the scarce amounts of rainfall we've got into really efficient grain production. But that means that we just don't have runoff into dams. So things like well-maintained roaded catchments are a really critical part of the story. But a real sort of key thing that we sort of found in this story is, or in this project was, the contractor skill and knowledge or just availability of contractors is a big issue. When I was working in a past life for the Department of Agriculture, we had dedicated people there, for example, that were training contractors that were doing this work. Those people just don't exist anymore. So we've got a real challenge out there that, we haven't necessarily resolved, but we're trying to answer those critical parts of the story in terms of skill and competency to create this water infrastructure. And it's a real strong need for that still. So one of the technologies that we tried here was repurposed PVC tarpaulins. And so the advantage here is just the difference in where or how much rainfall you need to run off water. And so this was originally about a 1.5 hectare roaded catchment. And then we were able to actually shorten that to about 0.7 of a hectare because of the efficiency of the catchment. And in this case, after only about 0.8 of a millimetre of rainfall over the day, this grain tarpaulin will repurpose. Grain tarpaulin's been created into a catchment, will actually start running water. And so what this meant at this site, this is down near Jacob along the south coast. So we're able to capture about 170 millimetres of more rainfall. And then, so the difference between a roaded catchment, for example, is also the efficiency. About 50% of that rainfall turns into runoff. In this situation, about 75% of the rainfall turns into runoff. So this meant about 0.83 or about 830 kilolitres of additional runoff into the dam. We've started to see additional sort of pickup of people starting to implement these systems. This is one option. We'd probably push people into using brand new tarpaulins if you're going down that pathway, or in particular using products a bit more like HDPE. Now, so for some people, their sort of feedback to us is they're not overly keen on these in terms of issues like plastics in the environment. That's a really big issue. These are going to degrade over time. They're going to eventually fall apart, and there needs to be a plan to deal with those. And so that's an important part of working out if these are right for you, or whether more conventional roaded catchments are options. But really, unless you have a high performing catchment, it's really difficult to collect enough water. This was another example of one of these sites. This is the Wandell property out the other side at Mount Ridley, out the other side of Esperance. What's really interesting here at this site was with our conventional paddocks and cropped type catchments, if you like, for existing farm dams, typically you need about 20 to 25 millimetres of rainfall. At this particular site, across the monitoring period, this is largely focused on the 2024 season, it's not a single rainfall event. It was more than 18 millimetres in a day. What that means is there's basically been zero surface runoff across the entire year. at this site. And so you can actually see the quantities of rainfall that, whoops, just trying to get rid of that. The quantities of rainfall, that these different sorts of catchment technologies will actually capture. So in this case, these high performance PVC HDPE type catchments that have about a 1 millimeter threshold, they're able to capture in this particular climate, and this will be variable depending on where you are for climate, but about 85% of the rainfall are events more than 1 millimeter in a day. So you're in the game. Roaded catchments are only capturing about 30% of the rainfall, and 20% if they're more at the end of less well maintained, or maybe they're in sandier soils and they're not quite so optimal. But basically, you're dead in the water if you're relying on surface runoff from cropped paddocks and things like that. So it's a really important lesson and really interesting having a look at some of the different sites. And this sort of pattern is relatively consistent. So you're talking somewhere, 80 to 90% of the rainfall is capturable, bearing in mind that your runoff coefficient, the proportion of that rainfall that turns into runoff, is only about half of that. But really, once you move, because of where the nature of our daily rainfall events is sitting, that ability to catch events less than, 10 millimeters, 8 millimeters is really important for water security. One of the other things that we looked at was subsurface drainage, and we're very interested to see these examples. So these are in, typically in duplex soil country, much higher in the landscape. There's no evidence of salt effervescence at the surface. So there's no evidence of surface salinity. It's just really a pure waterlogging problem. For these farmers, they've been very motivated by, really challenging access in these waterlogged areas during the season to get on and spray and to be able to, manage the crop. And then the idea was to just evaluate, is this a useful water resource that was out there? Basically, the conclusion that we came to is that it can be a useful resource. It's pretty variable. Obviously, if you don't have an above average or average type rainfall year and you don't have waterlogging, you don't have excess water to harvest. So we definitely wouldn't call this a drought proofing solution, but what we really think it does in those average and particularly the above average years, it can harvest some really high quality of water. So some of the water that was flowing out of these pipes, this one down near Cogent up on the left, was pretty good water. The one on the bottom right, there's down a system down near Darken. But yeah, some of that water actually had lower salinity than my tap water in Perth. So really quite high quality water. All of it out of all of the sites was definitely at a sort of livestock drinkable or spray suitable level. Bearing in mind, again, we're higher in the landscape, we're dealing with a pure waterlogging problem, and it's really important to differentiate if you've got a waterlogging problem or a waterlogging and salinity problem. So yeah, really useful way, and really thinking about, where you've got a problem, have you actually got part of a solution to increasing your water supply? So in some of these situations, they were flowing in the order of 1.5 to maybe 2 megalitres of water, of really high quality water, pretty low turbidity, really good sort of high quality water that was a really, big asset to the properties. But you really wouldn't want to rely on it if you had a series of below average years, like, for example, we did in 2018, 19, 20, that motivated a lot of this work. Next piece of the puzzle that we wanted to look at was a bit about keeping water in dams. And so this was these different evaporation covers. So some of the ones that we evaluated here are basically manufactured similar to swimming pool covers called Daisy Dam covers. One on the right there is a product called Hexacover that was trialled by the Water Corporation at a couple of their sites. It's pretty good. It's a bit on the expensive side, and so that was part of what we were looking at. We also did some work just sort of benchmarking evaporation losses. So how much water do you actually lose from a dam? And so these sites where we're monitoring with quite sort of sophisticated instrumentation to get really precise sort of measurements. But broadly, as a bit of a rule of thumb, you're going to lose somewhere between about 2 and 2.5 vertical meters of water from every dam. When we sort of model what this looks like, Basically, if you enter your summer and you have no rainfall in summer, so if you get that dam entirely full at the 1st of October, by the time you get to the end of April, only about 50% of that available water supply is, left there because the rest's evaporated or leaked. Um, so it's really important when you're doing farm water planning and you're looking at the infrastructure that you've got and its availability. As a rule of thumb, if you can get that dam full every winter, you've only got about 50% of that usable capacity. If, for example, you're trying to, deal with your summer weeds or put in your pre-emergent program with the cropping, as that season's just starting to break and before you've got any water left over. Also did some work looking at other things like treating leaky dams, and that can be really important. You can see here that the dams are evaporating somewhere in the order of 1.5, touch over 1.5 meters of water, but some of them are leaking, and that's very dependent on local conditions. But leaking in the order of 0.5 meter to well over a meter of water being lost from those dams. The Daisy Dam covers, and this is a site down on the Joneses property down near Gardner. So it was nice and windy down there on the south coast to test what it worked like in real world conditions. So the dam cover itself really needs to be, in the water for the whole time. So you need to be a bit careful with, if you've got the area and the dam goes right down and the cover gets left up, it can kind of turn into the world's largest sail and disappear. So you really need to keep them wet and in the water. In this case, it's kind of interesting because the manufacturer says that they're 99% effective on the covered area, but what we actually found, and you can kind of see why here, some of the water that sits and pools in between the sections, and some of the other factors, they're only about 70% effective under the covered area. And this is, I guess, why it's really important to do this sort of R&D work and at scale and on real farms. Also testing them at some of the other properties that we're integrating them with livestock to see how the livestock were, whether the sheep were just tripping up all over them and how well it worked. And it worked really well for them. So it was a property down near Scottsbrook, just south of Boyart Brook. They were, really happy with that, and that the host of that trial, he's probably looking at buying a couple more covers and putting them in as part of his system. He's, pretty happy with them. But yeah, basically at those sites, they were able to reduce evaporation losses by about 40%. So what we would say with evaporation technologies is they're really good, but if you don't get the fundamentals right, you want to be a bit careful. So if you've got a dam that's not really quite an optimal high quality water resource, you probably want to focus on fixing up the catchment rather than putting on dam covers. But if you do have these high reliable, high quality water resources, this one here's got a great roaded catchment. In this case, they had the good fortune that a whole pile of gravel was taken out for some road projects, and they were left with a really high performing roaded catchment. And actually, an undersized dam, they've enlarged the dam, they've put in the cover, and they've now got a really high reliable water resource there. The other one we did was just a bit of benchmarking work. So we know from some of the older work that was done back in the sort of 80s or 90s that shelter and trees around dams can be really effective, really valuable for putting in biodiversity. But they do alter the wind. You can see across this dam, it's a beautiful mill pond because there's not much wind. But basically, largely this sort of melaleuca and some surrounding eucalypts around this dam down near Kojonup, the evaporation losses were about 30% less than what we would have expected. So in this case, sort of no issues with the dam leaking. Leakage rates in this dam are actually really low, really ideal site, really nice way that it's been constructed, and a whole pile of melaleucas and things that are growing in and around this dam. So again, sort of stressing, sort of nature-based and really low-cost solutions, they might be, part of the puzzle. Last sort of part of the, kind of the on the tools part was some water quality testing, and in the process of chugging through some data that we collected down around Jerramungup area with Fitzgerald Biosphere Group earlier this year, but this was work that was done in sort of association with the Australian Herbicide Resistance team here at UWA. So collecting a range of different water resources, dams, water tanks, bores, and other things. You can actually go and access this report on the MadFig website if you're interested in having a look at this. We also provided, the individual information to the growers. One of the key things that was a bit interesting here, you can see on the plot on the left-hand side, this is pH, and then we divided it into all samples that we collected across bores, dams, in rainwater tanks, and then in scheme water. And then you can see that we've got sampling here from May of 2023 and March of 2024. One of the things that was, I guess, interesting for us was the pH of the scheme water. So again, some of this sampling was right at the kind of range margins of where the scheme exists. And you've got to understand what you've got, and you've got, large amounts of pipe network that is concrete lined, and you've not got huge amounts of water throughput. And so a lot of that water is sitting around, and so consequently has really high pH values. So one of the sort of comments here was then just being really aware of that. For example, if you're using that as a spray water for things like glyphosate, some of those pHs are probably beyond the usable range of what you'd really want glyphosate to be in terms of, it's a natural weak acid. And so pHs above about 8 or 8.5 can actually be really quite problematic for the performance and efficacy of that. So, yeah, understanding your chemicals and finding a really good agronomist who understands those chemicals and your water and doing water quality testing of your key water resources is a really, really critical part of where we would be, suggesting that people invest part of their efforts with their strategy, farming strategy. Don't go and throw hundreds of thousands of dollars at your chemicals without understanding what the 99% of your spray tank is made up of, which is the water. It's really, really critical. Last one's just sort of some other bits and pieces that we've been working on within the project team and the university, and some of the people also working with DPID. So one of the other things we've been interested in is trying to get a better handle on where we're actually sitting with farm water supplies. So we've been using some different satellite products. You can see some examples here on the left, very high resolution aerial photos and what dams look like under different sorts of satellite products, 3-meter satellite product and a 10-meter satellite product. And so we've been really interested in trying to use those. And so here's a piece of work we've just sort of published this recently. But basically using this Sentinel satellite, we've got, these, 180,000 farm dams. We can sit there with satellites and measure reasonably accurately, not particularly well because it looks really pixelated, but we can get a bit of a sense on where water is sitting. And that's what you see here in the blue line. And that's the kind of cumulative or total area of water. In this case, we've just focused in on the Shire of Kojonup local government area when we did it. And we've plotted that against the rainfall anomaly. And so we know that we've got these interesting tools. We're actually sort of got a session this afternoon to talk a little bit more about maybe trying to further develop these to have better, sort of planning and policy tools that allow us to really understand where we're at with on-farm water supplies, maybe being a little bit more proactive in trying to understand regions, where they're heading towards drought deficiencies or declarations, better informing and more targeting support around that, and also understanding the regions and areas that are much more, maybe under some sort of shortages of water, and where we can maybe target some of the outreach and the farm adoption sort of side of things. Last one I want to introduce is the water evaluation platform. So this was developed as part of the project to really update a lot of the farm water planning tools that we previously had at our disposal, which were very out of date, and to modernise them, to integrate them with much higher quality predictions of actual demand. So, for example, doing better things around what the livestock demand looks like, with proper gridded climate data, which gives us a much better understanding of that. And so the water evaluation planning tool, the water evaluation platform, WEP, and I'll just briefly show you what that sort of looks like in a second. Really allows you to do these different sorts of simulations and test your reliability. What we've done is taken a lot of the R&D work on actual sites and taken the sites where we're measuring water levels within a millimetre every 10 minutes, and then compared that to gridded daily data to see actually how good it is, and to ground truth our real R&D data with the model data, and we're really quite comfortable and really happy with how that's performing. So we think we've really got something that works and works in the real world, and we're able to accurately simulate what's actually happening on farm dams, and then integrating that with other things. So things like setting up, different demands and profiles, costs, allowing people to customize their own costs, and then to run some different scenarios on water availability. So what's sitting behind it is just a sort of relatively simple rainfall and evaporation water balance model that exists for the dams. That's driven by gridded climate data. So you click on a location, and that seamlessly pulls in the climate record that you want for that particular area. You then can build different sorts of catchments with different catchment types. Again, you can use our default parameters, which are what we think are the best representation of those different sorts of surfaces and how they perform in the real world. But you can also customize those, put in other sorts of inflows or transfers, and then it has a demand calculation. So you can customize that depending on whether you're focused on spray operations or irrigation outflows or livestock drinking. The livestock drinking actually then uses real climate data to sort of drive the livestock demand function of water demand. So you can access that here. I think Dim's popped that in the chat, which is always handy. If I just grab this screen, is that come across? Yep, winning, thank you. So within this, you can run it without setting up a profile. We'd recommend that people do set a profile, and that allows you to better customize your scenarios and customize your own water demand. So you can go into settings and log in. I'll just log into my profile here. So you can go into the water evaluation platform. Again, you can run this without having to log in. If people want to run scenarios and not do that. The advantage of logging in, if I go into here, or actually I'll just, you can go to the docs function here and use the WEP docs and user guide. That'll open a screen here and give you a bit of an introduction video and a bit of sort of explaining some of the concepts and how it works and the getting started. So you can kind of walk through this. I think it's pretty intuitive and easy to follow. And there's also some videos and other materials. You can access some of our case studies here. So these cover, some of the information that we talked about previously. For example, if I have a look here, here's a nice little summary of these different enhanced sort of catchments, some of the different sites, some of the costs, how they worked, what were the costs of the water at the sites. So in this case, roaded catchments were delivering water at about $1 to $3 a kilolitre. The high performance catchments were somewhere in the order of about $4 to $6 a kilolitre. And, I guess, reminding that carting water is always the single most expensive option. So they're a really nice resource, those case studies, if you want to find a little bit more. If I go back in, so we can, in my account here, for example, I've got different simulations that I've run in the past. I can set up my dam profile. I can view some of those, but let's, for example, set up a new one. So I might want to call this, I don't know, let's say farm in farming 2J, and then we might have, a set number of, sheep. We might have 1,000 sheep that we're trying to deal with in 3 summer months. We can do that for other cattle and things. Crop and other demands, we can use that. So you might be trying to spray maybe you're spraying, 500 hectares at 80 litres per hectare, and we might need to do a spray at different years. And this sort of spray calculator allows you to sort of create a demand function for that water. So you can see that farming 2J example's been saved there. So I can load that as my profile. I've got other different examples here. I can, cost profile. So I can go in here and customize all of the costs if I've got specific information from a contractor. These are based on benchmarking real costs now. So we think they're pretty accurate. But again, if you've got better information or custom stuff that you want to use, you can go and do that and so forth. If I just pull up an example, which is just a bit quicker than setting it up. Takes a little time for the server. So all of this runs in a cloud environment. So you don't have to download software onto your specific computer. Each sort of instance, it spins up a virtual computer that does the simulation. So here was one example where I was basically trying to run a spray program for about 1,500 hectares. And then I was playing with what sort of catchment would I need. So in this case, I was testing a plastic, so PVC or HDPE catchment, about 0.7 of a hectare on about a 2.8 megalitre dam. So it's coming up with some reliability figures. I can have a look at the dam performance in this colour, any of the deep red colours. It tells me where I've got not a lot of water left in the system. If I scroll down here, it'll actually tell me these dark red areas are when the dam's failed and run out of water. I can look here at the dam economics, so it's telling me how much it's estimating it would cost me to sort of build that catchment and that dam. And so you can run a whole pile of different scenarios here under different tools. You can use this one called dam design, and that more presumes that you've got a pre-existing catchment and you're trying to interrogate how big a dam should I build. And then the reverse side is the catchment analysis. I've got a pre-existing dam. How big do I need to build my catchment? Or I'm interested in converting my catchment from a natural paddock into, say, like a roaded catchment. How big do I need to make my roaded catchment? And again, you're then customizing that by loading things like the dam profile, which is the demand. So I might, have these different demand functions that I can load. And so that's what the water valuation platform is all about. When you run the simulations, if I look for dam location, I can maybe I'm farming somewhere out near Cunderdin. I can type in Cunderdin. I can go and find my my property wherever it is, and then I'm maybe got an area here that I'm interested in building a dam. I can put in the dimensions of the dam, and then off you go. So I'll probably leave it about there. But yeah, very happy to ask any questions or emergency design people a dam in 3 minutes or something like that. But yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to have a chat about what we've been doing, and throw it back to questions.
Thank you, Nick. I had 100 questions and then you systematically went about answering most of them. So that was just so brilliant. Thank you. The demonstration was amazing too. That's really cool that you can actually have an existing dam and then design your roaded catchment. That's awesome. I love that you guys tried to use secondhand tarps in your trials. I just think that's a lot of, obviously a lot of smart people thought hard about how you can do that in a realistic way, so practical on the ground. That's really cool. So I'd encourage everyone, if you don't know how to use the chat, please just unmute yourself and maybe butt in if you don't know how to use the little raise your hand thing, because I certainly don't. I'm going to just ask Nick a question. Do you think that, if it's really hard to get runoff off of these small rainfall events, and if we're going to see less and less winter rain, should we be making bigger dams and trying to capitalize on flood events, so those big summer events, and trying to keep the water in the dam post, say, a December thunderstorm?
I think thunderstorms are a real challenging one, and we've talked a little bit about what the strategy is with thunderstorms. Like they're so unreliable, but you really got to capitalize on them. And certainly the site host that we had, the out sort of North Bandee, Merredin sort of way, he got through, and he's got a mixed farming operation. He's got a couple of thousand sheep. The summer thunderstorms was basically critical, and he built that retrofitted roaded catchment, good sized roaded catchment. That was really successful strategy for him. The other things that we're starting to see, and it really depends on where you're sitting with your farming operation, is I guess there's these different strategies depending on if you're really cropping intensive or you're running more of a mixed operation, and then the size of your livestock exposure, and then what your potential strategies are if you are running out of water. So potentially you can cut your way out of problems if you've got 1,000 or a couple of thousand head of sheep, but like getting 100 kiloliters of water a week if you've got tens of thousands of sheep is a bit of a problem. So I think some of those people that we're working with are going to what we call key dams. So they're building, I guess the traditional, wheat belt dam, the 1960s, 1970s land conservation special is a kind of, 1.5, megaliter dam. It's got a natural paddock above it. It used to be great when you were running lots of sheep. It used to be great when you had the rainfall of the 1960s and 70s. So what we're seeing those people shifting is finding maybe within their property a couple of those that they can enlarge, or some new sites in general. Or look, the good sites have gone, so maybe enlarging is the place to go where they've got a really good and large size catchment to work with, and then getting the catchment and dam size keyed in. But they're more building, 5, 8. We've seen examples in the project. I think the biggest one's about 48 megalitres. That was a bit ridiculous. And they probably went a touch deep and got into some groundwater. So that is a problem to be aware of if you're trying to go big, is, really picking your site and not going too deep into the groundwater. So I think, it's really looking at, where you're going to get water from. The other thing, strongly encourage people to queue in tomorrow. I think some of the work that Richard George's team has done around on-farm desal, micro-desalination, is really, really quite exciting in terms of what I'd call kind of climate independent water. Where we've had those more marginal and brackish groundwater resources. The great irony of the wheat belt is we've got this salinity problem everywhere. Salinity is a water excess problem in this chronically dry landscape that we're trying to farm. So it's this real challenge of water and water resources. But I think in general, a few really high quality, really high reliable, dams with really high performing catchments is really where we're seeing the sort of innovative, farmers that are really pushing their water security. Also seeing ones, maybe more cropping intensive operations, really valuing high quality water. So one of the people that we got some of the ideas from those repurposed grain tarpaulin sites from, so they had invested, that was a corporate farming organisation, but they'd invested in HDPE catchment, a fully lined dam, 8 250,000 litre tanks. So they were basically storing 2 million litres of pure rainwater. And their comment was that was not, they actually went and built a second one when they went back to justify it. It wasn't a water quantity argument, it was a water quality. So their performance in, say, their ryegrass control and their spray operations, it was all about getting bang for their buck in their chemical program because they had high quality rainwater to throw at it and not crappy turbid dam water and sucking up the dregs in April to try and get their crop in.
Yeah, that's
Sorry,
amazing.
too
There's a
deep.
question. No, no, awesome. There's a question here from Nick. He said the Daisy Dam covers were not covering the total surface. Does that still reduce total evaporation by 70%?
Yeah. So the they reduced the covered proportion was reducing by 70%. They were then covering about 50% of the total dam area, which gives you about your 35 or 40% of what they did in total. Um, they were about, I think it was on the slide there, but I think they're about 16 to $18 a square metre supplied. And some of the rough economics that we calculated, the payback period on those was about 2 seasons. It depends on what value you put on water and how you cost that as to whether you're costing it against $4 a kilolitre water out of the pipe or carting water at $25 a kilolitre on the payback period. One of the ones that we looked at with the Water Corp was that hexacover stuff. I used to have a hexacover on my shelf there behind me. It's gone. But that was about $55 to $60 a square metre. So we found that that wasn't economic for farm use. But for the Water Corporation, where they were trialling that, they were having to tank water 3 hours by road. So their actual tangible cost was about $60 to $65 a kilolitre to supply water to some of those areas. So for them, that was an economic solution, and I think they've rolled that out in Wellstead, Ravensthorpe, Franklin, somewhere else, maybe Salmon Gums. Yeah.
Can I just encourage anyone who's got a question just to unmute and chuck it in there now? All right, looks like it's me again. Nick, with the subsurface drains that you talked about where you sort of need waterlogged soils with good quality water to make that work. Somewhere like in the wheat belt where we might have soils that are prone to maybe subsurface acidity. Obviously, that's not an ideal solution in that area, even if you've got waterlogged soils. Is that
Yeah, I mean,
like,
you got to be careful what you train. Yeah.
yeah.
I
So
mean, one of
that's
the other things yeah, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we were picking sites, yeah, on really sandy duplex soils that had really pronounced waterlogging, really checking and scanning for any evidence of surface salinity. In that case, yeah, the pH was really quite good, was, spot on in terms of, 6.5, 7, not low pH water. The surface waters that you tend to be intercepting in those are a bit different to your deeper, more acid groundwaters that you can get in places because you're kind of targeting that seasonal perch layer that you're getting in your duplex soils. But certainly want to be careful of that. One of the other things we've kind of been aware of, but not really looked at, which we need to, is particularly using that water with whether you've got a lot of leaching of nitrates and things like that, which are maybe going to be slightly problematic for your livestock if you're using that. So that's an area that we want to do a little bit of follow-up testing. In those examples, it was largely being used for cropping, but yeah, it's certainly one of those properties is using it as a water resource for sheep. So you want to be a bit careful around, I guess, what type of sheep you're then putting in with those waters if you do have that issue. But we'll certainly do a little bit of follow-up testing as part of ongoing work on that. We're sort of interested to keep some of those subsurface drains monitored to really understand how they perform. They're really, really variable. Like they either seem to go and you get like a couple of megalitres of water out of them and like really, really high quality water, or you kind of get nothing. Yeah.
So I have a question around, so if you sort of recommend you develop a couple of really good dams, great catchment and that kind of thing, all of the other little dams that you might abandon, what value do you see they have maybe in a more of a biodiversity context in the wheat belt?
Yeah, I've actually got some work kicking off around that sort of value of those water resources. So certainly they're going to have a huge potential biodiversity value. any sort of source of fresh water in a dry, arid, very fragmented landscape like the wheat belt, is probably going to be of high value. We also know some part of that work's also looking at the quality of water and things like methane and carbon production. There's some evidence to say where you improve the water quality of dams, you actually turn them into a net carbon sink rather than a source. Really poor quality dams can be a net, and particularly methane, which is obviously much more potent than carbon dioxide. Um, so putting vegetation in and around those dams is going to maybe deliver some benefits around, evaporation reduction, but also biodiversity. So I think we're seeing examples of some people that are also looking at land values and bulldozing them and trying to return that land into production. So that might be an option for some people, but equally, integrating those dams with broader biodiversity on the farm, thinking about the strategies that might exist there. There's also may into the near future be opportunities in things like the nature-based repair market or carbon markets and things like that to opportunistically use those less reliable dams in that space. So that's something that we're sort of tracking and trying to keep an eye on. There's not really a formalised market now, but yeah. Maybe a question there in the chat. Can you have eroded catchment with vegetation around the actual dam? So yeah, I think integrating the vegetation around the dam. Obviously, the eroded catchment's all about having that high performing, really cleared surface. The greatest value in the vegetation. We've done a little bit of benchmarking of this, trying to really unpick in detail the days of highest advantage, and really looks like those kind of really obvious type things that you'd expect, low humidity, high wind conditions, those howling, really super dry, low humidity easterly winds rip water disproportionately out of a lot of our water resources. So strategically targeting, I'd love to see a lot more vegetation integrated with farm dams through the wheat belt, and particularly thinking a little bit about your climate. If you're a bit more restricted or wanting to focus on where you put that, think a little bit about your climate and target those sort of prevailing wind conditions, particularly those summer conditions, which are really going to strip large amounts of water out of your water resources. Equally, thinking about, the value of that water resource. So for some people, fencing dams and excluding stock, having much better silt traps and reduction of that organic matter reaching the dams is having some significant benefits. So understand that for some people, the practicalities of that, it's a lot easier to just have your stock accessing the dam directly. But some evidence to say, for example, if you can exclude your stock, control your organic matter and fecal matter input into your dam, you can get 10 to 15% weight gain efficiencies in your livestock production. So, it depends on where your farming system and what's going to work for you is really sitting. But I think for some operations going to that sort of setup with small amounts of livestock and thinking about a lot of those small farm dams at present, they're not really that useful. You might have on a large farm you might have 20 or 30 of these things, and they all run out of water on the second week of January, and they're completely bloody useless. So what do we do with those in where we've shifted to large scale efficient agriculture and where we need to be. So another question there to water livestock. Can you install a submersible pump connected to water trough cover dam with days cover? Absolutely. Yeah, that's one option. The Robertsons that hosted the trial down near Scotts Brook, just south of Mayonup, Boyup Brook, he had livestock in that drinking directly from the cover. The dam with the cover. They seemed to be fine. There was no issues with that. But equally, yeah, trying to build these more closed systems where you're, pumping out. The one that I showed you down near Gardner, they don't really run any serious numbers of livestock there, but they've got like a buoy sort of connected to the pumping infrastructure, sitting in the middle of the floating cover, across into their own little standpipe, and they use that for spray water, and then it gets piped across to the young fella's house. He's got this immaculate bowling green lawn that he's now trying to attract every young lady along the south coast to come and check out his croquet lawn that he's got now. So yeah, there's got to be some points for that out there in the wheat belt.
Oh, that's awesome, Nick. I'm sure people can contact you after if their questions come to mind. We might wrap it up there. It's 12 o'clock. I want to thank you so much for the time that you spent schooling us on your work today, Nick. It was really, really interesting and really valuable, and it's kind of information that I know at Wheatbelt will be sharing with our landholders. I've already got a list of people I'll be sending the web tool link to. And I just want to also thank my team and acknowledge their work for putting this event together, and encourage anyone who's online to check out the webinar tomorrow with Richard George, same time. And then again on, what day is it today? On Thursday, on the 17th, we're going to hear from Warren Pensini, who's going to tell us about landscape rehydration project he's done on his property. So yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. I think I'll stop the recording. I'll remember to do that.